So what does it mean to learn from multimedia anyway? And what does the research say about how we're supposed to build our multimedia learning objects? These are two really important questions for developers, and we're going to target them in this presentation. Hopefully you're going to learn some very specific development strategies that will help you in your own instructional projects. We're going to start with a look at a very popular cognitive learning model, and then we're going to use it to understand some of Richard Mayer's research-based multimedia learning principles. You ready? All right, here we go. So, decades of cognitive research have suggested really convincingly that humans process information on two complementary channels, one for verbal and one for visual. But apparently we're pretty limited in the amount of information that we can hold, especially in short-term memory. We also know that for meaningful learning to take place, we have to be actively processing the essential information instead of wasting our time on what Mayer calls extraneous processing. We're going to look at this at multiple examples of this conflict throughout. But first, let's take a look at his very popular cognitive learning model. Now, I know this looks a little bit complicated, but it's actually pretty easy to understand. Let's go ahead and break it down. Mayer defines multimedia in a very simplistic way. It's any combination of words and pictures. These words can be spoken, or they can be written. And the pictures can be static, like an illustration or a photo, or they can be moving, like a video or an animation. Multimedia learning begins through perception, usually by a sensory organ, your ears or your eyes. Now, of course, for some learners, especially visually impaired learners, the actual sensory organ is through haptic or touch sense. But for the majority of us, anyway, it's coming through ears as sound or eyes as something that we see. So where the model gets interesting, and anybody who's married knows this, is in the selection process. Because we're absolutely inundated virtually everywhere we go these days with information, we can't possibly process everything. There is a limit to what we can perceive. So when we're reading or when we're viewing, when we're listening, etc., we have to selectively perceive information from this onslaught out there in the environment. So much stimuli. For example, when we actually are reading a page, we're really scanning. Lots of research in literacy has demonstrated very convincingly that we don't read every single letter in every single word, nor do we even look at every single object in the page. We scan very quickly through it and then make predictions. Our brain makes predictions. This is what helps speed up the reading process. So anybody who's married knows that it can be very difficult to hear everything, especially when there may be multiple audio tracks going on. Let's say you're sitting on the couch listening to a television show and your spouse asks you a question. It's sometimes very difficult to listen to both of those, and we're going to talk about that process and that conflict here in a great deal. So we selectively perceive. That's the point. Once that information is in short-term memory, the information gets processed on the appropriate channel, either verbal or visual, or sounds or images. But here's what's really cool about this model. Each channel can stimulate the other. For example, sounds can conjure images, and images can stimulate inner speech, which is something that you would hear then on the verbal or the sound channel. So after organizing everything, we end up with these new mental representations of the information. And that's what this golden egg is right here. We take the processed verbal information, we take the processed visual information, and any relevant prior knowledge, and we integrate them into some new mental representation that hopefully helps us actually remember whatever it is we're trying to learn. So here's where this cognitive model gets really interesting. It provides the framework for understanding what Mayer found, and others, his partners, found in their research in multimedia learning. And through that research, they came up with a bunch of these principles, and you're only seeing a subset of them here. These are the ones that I think are the most relevant to what we're doing, and I'll explain that within the context of the slides that we're going to take a look at here. But let's start with the first one. This will all begin to make sense, how this cognitive processing model relates to these specific principles that have been derived from his research findings. Let's start with the multimedia principle. My question to you, you've heard these cliches. Is a picture really worth 1,000 words? Does more media equal more learning? Well, according to the research principle, here's what it says. Students learn better from text and pictures than text alone. So there is an additive effect when you're comparing reading text versus looking at an image, some type of informational graphic. Why does this work? Well, let's take a look at an example. Maybe this will help. So here we have a combined media element. We have an image and we have text. Now, according to Mayer, this is what he calls multimedia. Students are going to learn better from something like this than something like that. Why is this so? Well, according to his theory and the cognitive processing model, because we learn this information in two channels, we're not overloading either one. The image is processed on the image channel and the text is processed on the verbal channel. And so there is no conflict. And we'll see conflicts here very shortly. Let's take a look at the next principle. The modality principle says students learn better from pictures and narration than pictures plus text. And this is where the dual channel model really becomes obvious. Let me show you. In this particular, if this were a slide in a PowerPoint or let's say any other type of slideshow-based presentation, let's assume here that the icon for the sound is simply my way of telling you that there is narration happening on this slide. Okay, that graphic wouldn't really be there. You would just be hearing information presented to you about the scientific process of fracking for oil extraction. So, and keep in mind that keywords in his research, keywords are okay. What we don't want is a lot of text posted up there, something like this. This does not work. The bottom slide does not work as well as the top slide. The top slide has narration and primarily an image. So the two channels are both being activated in complement to each other. You have an image that relates to the topic, and then you have narration that relates to the topic. Both of those are on their own independent channel. The image is on the image channel or the visual channel, and the narration is being processed on the verbal channel. So there's no conflict there. But in the bottom slide, you have a conflict. Why? Because the learner doesn't necessarily know which object to focus on, the photo or the text. And so it creates this extraneous processing that makes it not as effective as the slide up top. This is what Mayer and his colleagues have demonstrated in their research. You don't want to overload a visual channel. Reading is visual. Viewing a photo is visual. If both of those stimuli are coming in on the same channel and trying to be processed on the same channel, that channel can get overloaded. And now compare it instead to the model at the top, where you have the narration being processed on the verbal channel, and then you have the photo being processed on the visual channel. Those work in complement, and comprehension and learning is greatly improved relative to the bottom example. Now let's go back to this notion, or this idea that some people may have, that adding more media is always better. Is mo media, mo better? No, it's not. Not at all, because it overloads the channels. Here's what we mean. This is the principle. Students learn better from pictures and narration than pictures and narration and text. So there is no additive effect here. Let's take a look. Here's an example. Take our narration example. We've got an image and we've got narration. Remember, keywords are okay. So image and narration, that works better than image, narration, and text. Why? Because when we're reading, the process of reading is visual, but it can generate inner speech. This is the speech that we hear in our minds as we read. That speech, the inner speech, can conflict or compete with the narration that we're trying to hear as well, even though that's external. So you're trying to hear something externally while you're trying to hear something internally. And anybody who's ever tried to read a book while they're watching a really good television show understands this. You end up splitting your attention between the two. You read a little bit, you look at the television when something funny or interesting happens, and you're bouncing back and forth. This creates extraneous processing. It's unnecessary processing that diminishes learning. And that's why this example up at the top is optimized for learning. So narration plus pictures, and remember, pictures can be video, They don't necessarily have to be static pictures. They can be video-based or animation-based. But the combination of those work better than putting the actual text up there also. Here's what the coherence principle says. This is a really important one. Students learn better when extraneous material is excluded. Now this may sound like common sense. Mayer says that we need to avoid what he calls seductive details, and these can be text details, these can be unnecessary graphics. The content needs to be meaningful, it needs to be essential only. When you put content on a slide or in some type of document that doesn't need to be there, it distracts the learner, and learning obviously then diminishes. So let's take an example here. Now you might think that, oh, this isn't a horrible slide or combination infographic, but there are a lot of issues with this. It does have a nice organic color scheme though, but there's too much going on in this particular slide. You have a large call out at the very top, fracking. That might grab your attention, but you also have the goofy looking animated character on the right hand side. That's very large as well, and so there's a conflict visually between the two of those. We don't really know which one to look at, and then of course we have text below it to read as well. And then off to the left hand side you then have a diagram, a flow diagram that explains the process, and then of course we have links up on the top left hand side. There is way too much information here, and ultimately, as designers, we need to make decisions about what is the most important, the most relevant element to put on each particular slide or each particular page. And just because those links are there right now, and they're very important links, doesn't mean they're useful to this particular slide. So as a designer and a developer, you need to make decisions about how to break up your content and organize it coherently so that it doesn't overload the learner with additional details. And as a rule, goofy looking clip art and big graphic designs for most learning documents simply don't belong there. And we want to take a more conservative approach. So instead of something like that, how about something like this? Keep it very simple. You have an image, you have some narration, and a couple keywords. You don't have a whole bunch of text, and you don't have silly clip arts and punch outs and call outs and other ridiculous graphics that simply distract the learner. This works much better than what we saw previously. Similarly, the signaling principle should sound a little familiar to you, and you might be hearing echoes here of Robin Williams in her CRAP principle, specifically the principle of contrast. But there are some options here. Here's what the principle says. Students learn better with signals that organize the material, and there are a lot of them, such as cues. They could be arrows and shapes. They could be numbers. They could be animations that grab the learner's attention, but the point is that they direct the learner to the appropriate part of the document. In this case, we have a pretty comprehensive infographic here, or flow diagram, explaining the process of shale gas extraction. And so these cues then can tell the learner at least where to begin, or just at least the general direction of the information flow. And this is an organizational heuristic that's very helpful to learning. Another strategy for signaling includes lightboxing or highlighting. And lightboxing is a very practical way to take a complex diagram and focus the learner on a specific portion. And in this case, all we did here was just take a couple of rectangles and layer them over the actual diagram and add a little bit of opacity so that the area that we want to talk about, in this case the bottom left-hand corner of the diagram, gets emphasized. Another way you can do it is with call-outs, and call-outs can typically be large shapes. They're not always bad. You just want to use them selectively, especially, personally I find them very helpful when we're using them for outline effects rather than the entire background object, and sometimes adding a little animation to it can be helpful as well. And of course, don't forget, did you hear that? I'll do it again. Audio effects that is, can certainly grab users' attention and signal them to what they need to pay attention to. And sometimes when they're done in combination with another element, like this call out here, they can be very effective. So we've got a Got a light box combined with an audio whiff, and then we have a shape here that's a shape call out combined with an audio effect. Definitely grabs the user's attention, signals them that, hey, we need to pay attention to this part of the diagram only. And so this obviously helps the learner focus and improves learning. There are two kinds of contiguity principles. The first one is temporal, and Mayer found that students learn better when narration and pictures are presented simultaneously. Now this, I think, is pretty common sense. In other words, this works much better than just narration alone. If we were to explain a complex process like fracking using narration only, let's say, or maybe title, we have a title slide, a couple keywords here, and then we explained this complex process, that's not going to make much sense. The learner needs to see the visuals, and hopefully in conjunction with some of these cues here. And we'll talk about that next in the segmenting principle. But the point here with the temporal contiguity principle is that you shouldn't present content in isolation. So students learn better when you combine the actual narration with the actual pictures or diagrams. Present them simultaneously, like this or like this, not like this. Does that make sense? So why does this work? Well, the simultaneous visual and verbal processing, if we have them together at the same time, provided that they're on complementary channels. Remember, the narration comes on the verbal channel and the graphic or the diagram comes on the visual channel. Those work in complement to each other. And so we don't have that interference that creates unnecessary processing, extraneous processing as Mayer calls it. Spatial contiguity, on the other hand, this is going to sound a lot like Williams-Krapp principle of proximity. And the trick here with spatial contiguity is that students, or the finding rather, is that students learn better when words and pictures are near each other. Sounds a lot like proximity, doesn't it? Well, obviously there's a reason for that. And the simple reason why this works is that it reduces the cognitive load and the processing effort required because you're reducing the number of visual units on screen here. So we've got text and an image here together versus being separated above. We see this a lot in bad documents, especially bad PowerPoints. You'll throw an image up there and stick it somewhere in the slide, and then the text may have some white space or a big gap or other images or other graphics or other elements that are in the way. So keep your document elements together. Now the segmenting principle, I'm going to go ahead and say, is one of the most important for what we do as instructors. Here's what the principle says. Students learn better when a multimedia message is presented in user-paced segments. And the key word there is segments. Mayer has a very broad definition of what user pacing is. It doesn't necessarily mean user-controlled. It means you're presenting the content in bite-sized pieces that are commensurate with what the user can process without overloading. We're probably familiar with the term progressive disclosure. And in my opinion, this is one of his most important principles to guide actual multimedia development. So when you break it up like this and present it progressively, what that does is it minimizes extraneous processing. For example, let's take our diagram here for shale gas extraction. Now previously when we had everything presented up here all at the same time, even with the use of cues, that's still a lot of information. We know based on decades of cognitive research on short-term memory capacity that we can only remember about 7 things at any given time. In other words, the maximum number of elements that we should have on any one page should not exceed 7. So let's start with it really simple here. So we have some vertical layers that correspond to the Earth's surface here and subsurface layers. We have a title element. We have one graphic of the actual oil well. And then we have what looks like tubing that runs down through these various layers and terminates down in the actual shale layer. So this is easy enough to understand, to start our understanding anyway, of the shale gas extraction process. And when we present this information progressively, we're simply adding additional content, relevant content, as the narration describes what's happening. For example, we might use some signaling here, some directional arrows, and present this information progressively, describing how water and chemicals get injected into these pipes, and they flow downward, and they get to this terminating end, and because of the pressure that gets built up, it creates fractures in the shale layer. And within these actual fractures, we then use a call out here to explain how the chemicals and the water force the gas back up the pipe. So my point is, this progressive disclosure technique takes what would have been a very complex graphic and reduces it into bite-sized pieces that present the content in a way that doesn't overload the learner's visual and verbal channels. Now, if you watched Mayer's video carefully, you might have noticed that, his video at Harvard I'm talking about, you might have noticed that he didn't include his image principle. And yet his image principle was published in all of his earlier work. And it simply said that students don't learn better when the speaker's image is on the screen. And it's interesting because the evidence is very conflicting on this, and just recently, in some of the work that I've done as well, has explored whether or not a talking head video can actually have an additive effect to learning from other visual content that's on there. And so we're still working on this, obviously, but Mayer's concerned enough about it to pull it from his presentation at Harvard because of this conflicting evidence. So I find that very fascinating. And this is, like I said, where I spend a lot of my research time investigating how we can take talking head videos and integrate them to make them more effectively. So here is what we do know. If I were to take a talking head video and put it on top of this diagram and play the video while the diagram just sits there, this would not work very well. This would create a split attention effect. The learner would not know whether to look at the diagram or look at the video, when what would work better, as we've seen before, is just listening to the narration without any video so that you can focus then on the diagram, because the narration, again, is on the audio track, the verbal track, and then the diagram is obviously on the visual track. So those work in complement to each other. So this doesn't work here very clearly. But where it gets interesting is where you take a talking head video and put it on a background, or you add the other content, even content on other channels, and do so in a way that doesn't overload the learner cognitively. And we see conflicting results here. We sometimes see talking head studies that actually show positive gains when you don't have as much other content on. And if you can think about how we look at the news. When we watch the news, we're used to seeing a talking head, and we're used to seeing just a little bit of visual content behind them on a screen, either superimposed via chroma key or on an actual monitor that's right next to them, to the left or to the right. So the research has not been able to explain this discrepancy fully, and so I'll simply say that if you're going to use talking head in some of the objects that you develop, use it sparingly, or at least use it with additional information on screen that isn't in conflict. In other words, if she's doing the majority of the talking here, explaining what fracking is, we wouldn't want video in the background that is excessively complex. If you had a very complex video playing in the background, you would probably want to cut straight to that video and take her out of it, and then cut back to her talking when the content is less dramatic. And that avoids this potential for a split attention effect. But anyway, like I said, the research on this is still ongoing. Very interesting. Now, there are a couple more principles that Mayer puts out there in his earlier work, and even references briefly in his presentations at Harvard. But these, I think, are pretty straightforward. The first is his voice principle, which simply says that we learn better when the voice is human and not computerized. And by computerized, and again, you have to put this in context of when he did a lot of these studies. This was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. The computer voice he was talking about was kind of the Stephen Hawking, highly digitized, synthesized voice. That technology for voice development now is very, very impressive. And there are many algorithms now that can produce a synthetic voice that sounds just as authentic as a human voice. I know, scary stuff here. So The voice principle probably is less applicable now, in my opinion, less applicable now than when it was when he first started publishing. The personalization principle is pretty interesting, and this is worth knowing, but I think it's so obvious. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You be the judge. The personalization principle simply says if you're going to create effective multimedia learning objects, don't use language that's highly formalized. Obviously use correct language, but use personalized pronouns and tone when you're speaking to your learner so that it doesn't sound as insincere and formal. Using I's, you's, we's, especially for your pronoun usage, can make the learning experience a little bit more personalized, and he has found that performance does improve. So that's a lot of theory. Let's go ahead and apply some of these theoretical principles and research-based principles to actual examples. That might make us feel a little bit more confident. Take a look at this graphic of the water cycle. I'm going to go ahead and say this is a pretty good infographic. We see lots of these types of graphics that describe what the water cycle is. Okay, obviously this is static. There's no animation built in this. We don't really have any coherence issues here. All of the information here seems to be very relevant. There's nothing here that is really designed to distract our attention unnecessarily. We've got some good signaling with the arrows as they imply the flow of information, as well as in this case the actual physical flow of the process. We don't really have any redundancy problems because there is no narration. You could say, I guess if you had to be critical of this document, and this is so minor, you could say that there's a minor contiguity problem with the word precipitation and perhaps evaporation, because the word precipitation is not very close to its cloud where it actually forms. It's down there right on the mountain. And evaporation is up there in the blue with the arrow coming off of the land when it's really the lakes and streams, the water that's evaporating. So that arrow should probably be over the lake and not over the land. But that's so minor, just a minor contiguity problem. But I would think this is a pretty good graphic. Contrast that to this one. Holy cow, what in the world are we looking at? This is an awful infographic for so many reasons. And Mayer's principles provide a really good framework for us to use to analyze and explain why this is so bad. Now we look at it and the first thing we might say is, oh my gosh, that page is so busy. Well, what does that phrase even mean? Busy. Busy means you've got cognitive channels that are getting overloaded. That's what busy means in the theoretical sense. But if we look at his principles, we can say a lot of things are wrong with this. For example, segmenting principle. Probably the most notable problem here. There's simply too much information. It needs to be collapsed and broken down, perhaps with some spatial contiguity grouping this information so that there's less on the page. Ultimately, you just don't need a lot of this stuff. So, and all this extra material create significant coherence problems. So we can apply the coherence principle here as well. Specifically, what's wrong? Well, look at all these silly raindrop characters. They're cute, and I understand that this is probably targeting younger learners, but at the same time, it doesn't work according to Mayer's research. These are a perfect example of what we would call seductive details. Very cute and catchy, and oh wow, he looks like Casper the Friendly Ghost or whatever. Actually, young kids wouldn't even know what Casper the Friendly Ghost is, but maybe some of you do. Whatever, I digress. The point is we have multiple coherence problems here that are driven by the large proliferation of too many seductive details, especially these little graphics. We also have, and they're also in the sidebars also, we have signaling problems. For example, where do you begin? There is no signaling here. There's so much emphasis on so many different graphic elements, the eye doesn't know where to start. So a major signaling principle problem as well. Spatial contiguity, also look at the sidebars. The sidebars are just this vertical pile of a graphic with a series, or graphics with series of text elements shoved in between. We don't really know which graphic is associated with which text element because they're very symmetric. This is not good multimedia design. So in just a couple minutes, we've been able to identify segmenting problems, coherence problems, signaling problems, and contiguity problems. This is why Mayer's principles provide, or how I should say, Mayer's principles provide a fantastic framework for analyzing why a multimedia learning object does not work very well. Remember Mr. Dewey's rap on long division? Well, the principles can explain why this doesn't work as well either, but it can also identify some things that may work well. Take a look.
Mr. Dewey exclusive, this is what you've been waiting for. Better than the best on the planet. Now. Draw a line up to the right, take the number you're dividing by, put that number to the left of the line. Now put the number you're dividing with inside of it, setting up for long division. If you listen, that's the bottom line of it. I try to get this answer to this problem that I'm about to give. 309 divided by 6. Now the 6 won't fit in the 3, but it fits.
Okay, so there's no sense killing ourselves listening to this. It's obviously very catchy, and he's a very talented musician and rap artist. He actually has this whole series of albums. I think I mentioned that to you earlier. But the point here is that Mayer's principles can explain to us some things that are done well in this video. And I think one argument you can make is that his use of signaling here is very appropriate. How is it being used? Well, we've got color that's being used to signal the learner about how the different digits are manipulated during the actual division process. He also uses animation to temporally separate some of the elements there, the dividend, etc., that we saw earlier when that first came up on screen. And that's also an example of segmenting. So a lot of that works really well. Where his videos have been criticized is for coherence, specifically the music itself. It's so catchy, it's so well produced that it may simply distract the learner and encourage them to merely enjoy the music and not so much the message of the music. And so that's where his videos have suffered some criticism. But the point again is that Mayer's principles provide a nice way to analyze this as an actual learning object. I hope you would say, I guess before we leave this, I hope you would agree that a karaoke version of this would be a real obvious way to create a split attention effect. Or would it? If we put the words to what he's singing right up on screen here, what effect would that have? In other words, right down there underneath 390, if we had the text come up on screen, just like karaoke machine, and the learners would have the opportunity to read the lyrics while listening, while looking at that, while looking at the actual video. That would create a redundancy effect. Okay, so anyway, I just wanted to extend his principles there a little bit and remind us how all of these principles can interrelate. So clearly, the karaoke version of this video would be even worse than what we're seeing right now. So let's wrap up with one final review of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Information comes to us in words and pictures from the environment, and we selectively perceive it. We hear narration, we read printed text, we see information, and so that will happen on the appropriate sensory organ, the ears or the eyes. We don't get all of it, but we select some of it. It then gets processed on the appropriate channel, the sound channel or the verbal channel or the image channel or the visual channel. And depending on the type of information that's being processed, it's either done in complement or it creates overload situations and learning is impeded. But at the very end of it, the golden egg that we're chasing here is this organizational integrating of the new knowledge with prior knowledge and making these what Mayer calls these new mental models. So what does it all mean? Well, if we reduce to just the key concepts, the takeaways are actually pretty simple. As instructional developers, if we honor Mayer's principles, truly, and use them to guide our development, the learning objects that we build are going to end up leveraging both the visual and the verbal channels. And they'll do so without overloading the learner's limited cognitive capacity. And they'll avoid wasting learner time with extraneous processing and instead encourage active processing of the target content. That's how multimedia becomes meaningful. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you online.